Israel keeps killing Palestinians in Gaza even as a ceasefire agreement is reached to end 15 months of war. It's due to come into effect on Sunday, a day before Donald Trump's return to the White House. So what's the deal? Why now? And what could undo it? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. News of a long-awaited ceasefire prompted celebrations in Gaza on Wednesday night. But in the hours that followed, it was business as usual for Israel's killing machine. Attacks killed dozens of Palestinians after the agreement between Israel and Hamas was announced. The ceasefire is due to start on Sunday, part of a deal reached following increased pressure from the incoming Trump administration in the US. So can the agreement lead to a lasting peace? What difficulties lie ahead? We'll discuss this with our guests shortly. But first, this report from Kulsum Sharif.
After 15 months of death, destruction and displacement in Gaza, the announcement of a long-awaited ceasefire deal. It comes after intense negotiations were held in Qatar's capital, Doha.
Qatar, Egypt and the United States are happy to announce the success of joint mediation efforts to reach a deal in Gaza, to exchange prisoners and hostages, to return to a prolonged truce that achieves a permanent ceasefire, and also the delivery of large amounts of humanitarian aid to Palestinians.
The three-state ceasefire is due to be implemented on January the 19th. The initial phase will last 6 weeks, in which the bombardment of Gaza will stop. The Israeli military will withdraw from populated areas to the outskirts of the Strip, allowing displaced Palestinians to return home. Hamas is expected to release 33 Israeli captives in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. And desperately needed humanitarian aid will flow into Gaza with 600 trucks a day.
But this agreement has a clear mechanism for the first 42 days, and there is a clear mechanism to negotiate phase 2 and 3.
In the second phase, Hamas is expected to release all remaining Israeli captives in return for more Palestinian prisoners. It will see the full withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Philadelphia corridor along Gaza's border with Egypt. The third and final stage will involve the two parties exchanging the bodies of the deceased and focus on the reconstruction of Gaza. Outgoing US President Joe Biden and President-elect Donald Trump have both taken credit for securing the deal. In Israel, there was relief and hope, especially among the families of the captives. In Gaza, there were celebrations even as Israeli strikes continued. Israel's war on Gaza has killed more than 46,000 Palestinians and repeatedly displaced an entire population, leaving people facing hunger and disease. Kulsum Sharif, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Before our panel discussion, let's hear from two guests directly affected by the war. In a moment, we'll hear from the relative of an Israeli captive held in Gaza. But first, let's speak to someone living in Gaza. Omar Saleh. Omar, what's your reaction to the deal?
First, I feel the deal is a necessity. It's a necessity to stop the killing, the necessity to stop the killing of innocents, of children, of women. But at the same time, it builds a new hope for Palestinians to start again, to build their lives, to go back to their home after more than a year of being displaced and being oppressed and sieged. So I'm hopeful that this is a huge step towards a permanent ceasefire, and this could not have happened without the pressure, the international pressure on Netanyahu's government, because they have colonial aspirations, and we could see that in Lebanon's latest aggression. So they don't want to withdraw, and they have aspirations in Syria. So I'm hopeful But let's see. Let's wait for the second phase. Maybe it's going. I have huge hopes that this time it could work, and this is a huge step towards a permanent ceasefire. And yes, I'm hopeful about it.
Thank you to Omar Saleh. Now, retired Israeli journalist Oded Lifshitz was taken captive during the October the 7th attack. His grandson Daniel in Tel Aviv gave his reaction to the deal.
My reaction is, I've been waiting for a long time to get to that moment, and now when there is an agreement about the hostage release and a ceasefire, I'm happy from that, and I'm looking forward to see the hostages going on. And moreover, I'm looking over that all the parties will ensure that this deal will be a full deal of all the hostages coming back, and that there will be no issues in the upcoming days. So on Sunday, we can start to have hostages coming back from Gaza in Red Cross jeeps. If I look backward, I see a lot of things. I mean, let's go back to October 7. How is possible that old man like my grandfather, 84 years old, great-grandfather, the only great-grandfather held hostage in the world for more than 460 days, something that could never ever happen in any religion and culture in the world on October 7. So let's look forward. Let's bring back the hostages home, start a ceasefire in Gaza, and continue for a different era of the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
Let's bring in our guests. In Doha is Diana Buttu, a Palestinian lawyer and former legal advisor to the Palestine Liberation Organization. In Tel Aviv, Mairav Zonszein, who is a senior Israel analyst at the International Crisis Group. She covers domestic Israeli politics and relations with the Palestinians. And in Belfast, we're joined by Beverley Milton-Edwards, a non-resident senior fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs and co-author of Hamas, The Quest for Power. Welcome to you all. I want to start with Doha and with Diana. Diana, it's very difficult to be joyous about this ceasefire announcement, given that we are witnessing a genocide. But is there any reason to be optimistic?
I think just seeing the bombs stop falling on the heads of Palestinian children and the complete decimation of the healthcare system is the reason that you see so many people who are optimistic. They've literally survived genocide. And so people are happy that the bombs are going to stop. The real question is whether this is going to be sustainable and whether Israel is going to actually allow Palestinians to live in freedom. I have my doubts about this, particularly since I haven't seen that the international community has stepped up and exerted any pressure on Israel over the course of the past 15 months to end this genocide. So while people are happy, I think that we have to be looking beyond just the immediate and looking to the future and asking ourselves whether we want to see this repeat again or whether the world is actually going to do something to make sure that Palestinians are finally free.
Mairav, in Tel Aviv, one of the things about this deal is that it's causing a lot of controversy within Israel itself. The hard right, far right politicians are seemingly against the ceasefire deal, particularly the second phase. They say Israel should go to war against. There's still plenty of time for this deal to be scuppered, right?
Yes, well, the far right is explicitly against the deal and is threatening to topple the coalition. Netanyahu does have a majority that he needs in the cabinet and in the Knesset, the parliament, to pass the deal. The question is if they will actually quit the coalition. Now, I have been putting my bet on the fact that they won't, because while in power, they have done extraordinary, destructive measures in the West Bank to the Israel police, and they have achieved a lot of things that they want to achieve against the Palestinians and for a greater Israel. And Smotrich, the finance minister, is polling quite badly. So if he leaves the coalition, his alternative is not great. At the same time, he is threatening. So Netanyahu is now in a corner because, as far as I can tell, the deal is done. But he might not have a coalition at the other side of this. And I think he will do everything in his power to try to promise them things that they will be able to get under a Trump administration if they stay. But we are now at almost 4 p.m. in Israel. The cabinet and government are supposed to pass the deal procedurally and officially here today so that it can take into effect Sunday, and he still hasn't done so. And there's been radio silence by Netanyahu since the deal was announced last night.
Beverley, let me bring you in here. One of the interesting things about this deal is the US President, Joe Biden, the outgoing one, saying that this was the same deal that he presented that was rejected by Netanyahu. But then we have Trump saying, I made this deal happen. Is there a backroom deal that's been done between Netanyahu and Trump that's got to this stage, do you think?
Well, there's certainly speculation that some form of incentives, which, listen, are perfectly normal in any kind of ceasefire negotiation, as we well know from Northern Ireland and from other ceasefires in Israel-Palestine. So there's definitely speculation that forms of incentives have been offered to Netanyahu. And that could include, from the Trump administration, a green light on further annexation of occupied Palestinian territory or occupied Syrian territory, and also that signaling that maybe things like sanctions that have been put against Israeli settlers in the West Bank by the Biden administration will be rescinded by the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio.
Diana, if there is a backroom deal, and if it is the annexation of the occupied West Bank, annexation of Syrian territory, settlers being allowed to continue the way they are behaving in the occupied West Bank, that doesn't bode for a longer peace deal, or in fact scuppers a longer peace deal. Is that acceptable?
Absolutely not. And I think that we have to be very careful in kind of presenting this as some sort of Trump achievement. It is correct that this is the same agreement that was presented back in May, and it's the same structure of the same agreement back in March of 2024, and the same structure as in November of 2023. And it's clear that this could have ended with a simple phone call by President Biden, but instead he funded it. At the same time, I think we have to be very cautious in saying that this is somehow Trump working his magic, because what we do know is that this isn't going to be without reward, that Trump is going to reward Israel. And the idea that somehow a state that has been genocidal, that's perpetrated genocide for over 15 months, is going to be rewarded is obviously very troublesome. This is where it becomes very important for the rest of the world to step in and to actually make clear that genocide is not acceptable, that colonialism is not acceptable. And we already have some decisions by the International Court of Justice saying that the world now must act. So the idea that Trump is going to give away Palestinian territory and that this is going to be accepted is obviously false. And it's up to the world now to put into place measures to make sure that that does not happen.
Mairav, the world has failed, let's be honest, when it comes to putting pressure on Israeli politicians domestically. Israel has been able to withstand that pressure just because the Americans are backing them. Is there anything the international community can do if this indeed is a potential deal, this annexation?
First of all, my analysis is that Netanyahu specifically isn't necessarily interested in formal annexation because he's able to push through de facto annexation without dealing with any of the legal consequences for a very, very long time. So I'm not sure that's necessarily the route that he would choose to take. Certainly the far right wants that. But this ceasefire, which is already full of loopholes and already may not see the full fruition to the end, which would include the ability for Gaza to be rehabilitated and reconstruct. I mean, it is already shaky, and for it to have any hope of actually leading to a political horizon for Palestinians and security for both Palestinians and Israelis, then the international community, which is not just the U.S. but the European Union and others, some of whom have tried, not in the West, in the global South, would have to hold Israel to account. And that has not happened yet. If they want to see this through, and if Trump specifically, who has put some political capital now into closing this deal, if he wants it to not fall apart quickly, he's going to have to, and his administration are going to have to do a lot to make sure that it stays. And I'm not sure I see that happening. At the same time, you have this, really weird situation in which Trump and not Biden is the one to kind of close this deal. And so what are his expectations of Netanyahu? And even in this transactional agreement that they might have orchestrated, Netanyahu is in a very precarious situation. So again, like the likelihood is that this deal will not actually stay the course, and it will be traumatic for everybody involved. But if the international community doesn't want to go back to the same place that we've been in for the last 15 months, it's going to have to start holding Israel to account. For example, it could respect the arrest warrants by the ICJ for Netanyahu and former defense minister. It could insist on the end of the siege in Gaza permanently, and it could help Palestinians reach a point where they can politically renew and start an election process and all the things that they are not able to do at this point. So that would be a start.
Beverley, I was speaking to one of the former senior people in the occupied Palestinian territories, United Nations official, and he said to me off the record, this isn't the best deal, but it's the deal that we can get. But he's fully expecting it to fail. Do you think that is the expectation generally, that this is a deal that will fail?
Well, look, I think anybody who's ever been involved in mediation or negotiations for ceasefires or peace deals, be they in Northern Ireland, South Africa, or in the Middle East, expects failure. And that's why processes and very boring mechanisms of monitoring and verification, timing of the rounds of negotiation, and the things that our other participants have been addressing, which is international pressure and international will be very, very important in at least shoring up the current agreement. At least we can say that for 42 days, and I think this is very important, and it echoes the remarks of Omar from Deir al-Balah, at least for 42 days, there is some glimmer of hope for every Palestinian living in Gaza, in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and for Israelis whose families have been held hostage since October the 7th. We shouldn't squander that hope. We should, as an international community, as diplomats at international organizations, we should continue to marshal efforts to shore up the ceasefire process so that after the 42 days, we can get to phase 2 and a permanent ceasefire, a sustainable ceasefire, which again will open up the gates for the next stage, which would be the recovery and rehabilitation of the Gaza Strip. Now, we do know that the Saudis are leading the global alliance on the implementation of a two-state solution, along with the EU and Norway, and they were meeting yesterday. And of course, Saudi Arabia will also be a key player, even though at the moment it appears to be on the periphery of the mediation that took place in Doha to reach the current ceasefire arrangements.
Let me bring in Diana here. Diana, I want to talk about these negotiations from a Palestinian point of view. You've talked about this before, that it's almost a universal truth that whenever the Palestinians negotiate, they are often negotiating under pressure and from a position of weakness. And Israel is leading the charge, as it were. But now we have a genocide in Gaza. Has that put pressure on the Israelis to soften their position, or have they just got harder? And do you have any faith in these negotiations being led by Saudi Arabia that are taking place in Norway?
No, I have no faith in them whatsoever. And the reason I have no faith is because of the fundamental power imbalance. The reason that Palestinians are always on the weaker side is because they're living under Israeli military rule. And what that means is that Israel can call the shots. They can call the shots on how our daily lives are lived. And unless there is a third party to actually put pressure on Israel to end its military occupation, then it's always going to be a situation in which there's a power imbalance. Now, the fundamental problem here is that nobody wants to do this. And over the course of the past 15 months, rather than Israelis looking inwards and saying, how is it that we got to this position? And maybe we have to give up this idea of perpetual war and perpetual control and this mentality that the only way that we can be safe is if Palestinians are unsafe. Instead of them doing that, they've doubled down. So I fully expect, and you already see it in this agreement, that there's going to be even greater elements of Israel trying to control Palestinians, everything from how many trucks come in, what types of trucks, who's allowed to monitor, who's allowed to leave. I mean, this is precisely what Israel has always been doing. And unless there is a shift, a fundamental shift in mentality of one that views that Palestinians have a right to live freely and independently without Israel, then I'm afraid that we're going to be back in the same position over and over again.
Mairav, it's an opinion that I've heard over and over when I've been in Israel, when I've been in Palestine, where people say the Israelis just want us Palestinians to be happily occupied. They don't want us to kick up a fuss or do anything that will rock that particular boat. And Israel's been very, very successful at occupying the Palestinians. There's no impetus for Israel to change in any way its strategy of simply subjugating the Palestinians. There's no pressure at all, right?
No, there's no pressure, but I do think that the October 7th attacks are a good illustration of why it's not actually tenable. It might have been sustainable, but ultimately there is a price to pay for continuing to be an occupying power. And now, after 15 months, Israel is wanted for war crimes. Israeli soldiers are trying to be tried or arrested abroad. Unfortunately, Netanyahu himself has not yet had to pay a price politically or internationally, but it is individual Israelis are and will start to pay that price. Israelis think about where they travel. Soldiers are going to have to think twice about what they're posting online. There's going to be changes in how Israelis understand the way they interact with the world. And so, ideally, the people in charge would be held to account first. But the way this process is starting, it's starting from the individual Israeli. I'm hoping that the trauma of October 7th, the lack of faith in this government, the fact that there is a real tension between the military, which, as you alluded to, wants to have a kind of enlightened and happy occupation, and a political echelon that wants full-on annexation, that out of that, Israelis who have been displaced from the north of Israel, from the south of Israel, who want this hostage deal and see that this government is working to undermine it, that they will start to change their political behavior and their voting patterns. It might take a long time, but at some point, and I think everybody sees that Israel's objective in Gaza, with all of the military that it's pushed and the destruction that it's caused, has not brought Israel any closer to removing Hamas from power or providing real security. So hopefully Israelis will start to realize that.
Beverley, in your dealings with the Israelis, in your dealing with the Palestinians, have you noted a shift in the Israelis' attitude? Have they become weaker because of the genocide going on in Gaza? Or is the same idea that we are in charge and we are strong still prevails?
I think overall what we see from Israel, and particularly its political establishment, backed up by, very strong public social media and media narratives, that they, despite the calamity and despite the shock that was visited on them on October the 7th, and as Mairav pointed out, what that meant in terms of, the old usage of the phrase that Israel will always be secure, we build walls, we occupy for the purpose of Israel's security. Despite the fact that that was literally blown apart on October the 7th, what we see is that Israel can remain intransigent, and can remain intransigent because the international community, and particularly the US, whether it's the Biden administration or the forthcoming Trump administration, it literally encouraged them to do so, fund them to do so, politically and diplomatically support them to do so. So that in itself is sufficient for it to remain rigid, to remain unyielding, and which is why it's so difficult to get concessions that are so important, compromise and concessions which are so important in any negotiation, in any mediated process and dialogue, to reduce violence, manage violence, achieve a ceasefire, and eventually achieve peace with a two-state solution where both the Palestinian people and Israelis can literally live in peace side by side.
Diana Buttu, as all of this was going on in Gaza, it was getting worse in the occupied West Bank. There was a war that was often unseen, unheard of by the international community going on. Israel was arresting by the thousands people, raiding refugee camps. It was killing people on an almost industrial scale when it came to the occupied West Bank. Where is the Palestinian Authority in all of this? They've come under a tremendous amount of criticism when it comes to Jenin refugee camp, for example, and facilitating Israeli raids there. Where's the occupied West Bank and the PA in all of this now?
I think it's important to keep in mind what Israel's done over this period, which is not just the raids, but also killing and also the taking over of Palestinian land. They've expropriated more land in the course of the past 15 months than they have in 20 years. And when it comes to the Palestinian Authority and where they are, the Palestinian Authority, we should really simply understand it as being no greater in power than a local mayor. And rather than them standing up and pushing and demanding an end to this genocide and trying to support Palestinians, we've seen that the Palestinian Authority has sat back and done nothing on a best case scenario. And in a worst case scenario, has actually gone after people in Jenin as well. It just shows just how the two are connected, how Israel is so connected to the Palestinian Authority. And as I and others have said in the past, the Palestinian Authority is no better than Israel's security subcontractor, which means that it's carrying out the work that Israel demands that it carry out. And this is because it's also at the request of the international community. We must break this mindset that somehow Palestinians are a security problem or a security threat, and instead be addressing the fundamental issue, which is the lack of Palestinian freedom. And once we put into place measures to make sure that Palestinians are free, then we won't be having this conversation about a Palestinian Authority that is doing nothing to support its people.
A very quick follow-up, Diana, because you've made a very interesting point there. Is it then time for the Palestinian Authority to disband and we go back to the Palestine Liberation Organization, a resistance movement? Is that what you're saying?
For a long time, I and others have been talking about dismantling the Palestinian Authority because it's overstayed its welcome. It was really only designed to be in place for a short period of time, for 5 years, and then to be replaced by a permanent Palestinian government that's elected. At the end of this month, Mahmoud Abbas will have been in power for 20 years. He was elected for 4. And that's it. And unless we go down the path of not looking at just the Palestinian Authority as limited in jurisdiction, limited in the places in which it can operate, but instead transform it into a government that's representative of all Palestinians and that is pushing for liberation, for independence of all Palestinians and their land, then I'm afraid that we're going to be stuck in the same circle over and over again.
I want to thank all our guests, Diana Buttu, Mairav, Zonszein and Beverley Milton-Edwards. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.